Good morning. My name is Ann Shi. with the Houston Asian American Archive. Today is October 28th. We're interviewing Mrs. Susie G. And thank you so much, Mrs. G, for joining us today for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, to start, can you tell us when and where were you born?
I was born in Rosedale, Mississippi, July 21st, 1932.
Could you share with us a little bit about the neighborhood you grew up in?
Well, actually, it was my father had a grocery store, and actually, we lived in the back of the grocery store, it was a house that he had built. And we grew up in the store. And when we were old enough, I guess you would say, we would help in the store too. I had older brothers and sisters because me being a younger one, I probably didn't do as much as they did. But um, it was a small town, and we had customers. My father had customers that came in and usually asked for him because he spoke English, which my mother did not. She did speak broken English, and we used to just run around in the store. We could, when we got older enough, I could not go to the school that was in Mississippi, and they had built, I would say they because I don't really know who did it, but they had a school in Cleveland, Mississippi for all the Chinese kids that could not go to school in Mississippi. So they had a school there that taught grade 1 to grade 12. They had two Caucasian teacher. One of them would teach 1 to 6 and the other one teach 6 to 12. And after they taught, which was around, I would say 8 o'clock till probably 3 or 2, then there would be a Chinese teacher that would come in and teach us Chinese. So we had both language in one school.
That's interesting.
And we traveled back and forth from Rosedale to Cleveland, Mississippi every day to go to school. And then we came home and until probably when I was going to, I would say, the last part of elementary up into the junior high, my father heard that in Tennessee, they were allowed Chinese to go to school there. So we moved. We had three other cousins, which was four family, got together and bought a house there, and we all went to school there in Memphis, Tennessee. And I was there up until junior high when my brother said that he needed help in the grocery store here in Houston. So that's when I moved here to Houston.
That's so interesting. And what languages does your parents speak? You said your mom
But
doesn't.
mostly my mother speaks Chinese, and so I had to speak Chinese to her most of the time. My father speak both English and Chinese, so we had, like, I guess, Chinese and English at home. And I think actually we spoke Cantonese, not Mandarin. And we had, well, all my brother and sister spoke Cantonese too, but I've lost a lot of that since I don't speak it hardly anymore. It's been 20 years since I've had people that I can talk to. but I do remember some of it and I do understand a lot of it still.
Yeah, yeah, that's so helpful. And I'm wondering, did your parents were your parents born in China, or
They were born in China. My father came over when he was very young. And gosh, I really don't know how old he was, but I knew that he was because all of us were born here in the United States, and um, he came over first and then he went back and got his wife and brought her over. But if you ask me what year that was, I don't know. I just knew that they came over and all the kids were born here in the United States.
do you remember they speaking about which city and why they moved
All I know is that I think they were from Zhongshan, they called it.
in Guangdong and like some,
Guangdong, I don't know. That was the only one that I heard that I thought they were from Zhongshan, and they did say it's changed now, so I don't know. I've never been back to China. And actually, my parents had never gone back since they moved here,
wow.
you know.
And when your parents first moved here, did they have any family here?
No. In fact, he had brought over his two brothers. He had two brothers he brought over, and then he had a paper sister.
I see. And
And I think she was the one that actually uh, brought up that about the Chinese not being able to go to school in Mississippi. And she came here to Houston before my father did, and we came over later after she had invited him over. Said that it was real nice here and everything else. So that's when he sent my two brothers here to go. Well, we all worked in a grocery store all our lives. So my two brothers came over here and they opened a store, one store at first, and they opened the second one and they needed help. So that's when I said I was going from junior high to high school. I would just move here too, to help them out. And so that's when I moved to Houston to help my brothers out in the stores. They had one on Lyons Avenue and one on Hardy Street.
that's interesting. And what were the primarily produce that you sell in the grocery store?
Oh, mostly anything. One thing I did notice that when I came here, it was very unusual because at home in Miss Rosedale, we had all the canned goods and all the grocery around the walls of the store, and there was a counter around the whole store. And every time a customer would come in, we would have to get the item for them, and sell it to them like that. But when I came here to Houston, it was self-serving. All the goods were out in the store and the people just pick it up and go and check out at one place. So anyway, that was the one thing that I thought was very unusual, but that's what we did.
Yeah, a
And I
lot.
think all of us had worked in the grocery store all out, ever since we were young. So we knew how to count and all this and that. That was one of the first thing that we did learn how to do is count and can make change and everything like that. But my mother, even though she cannot read or write, she did pick up um, a little English, but she can really add because she can add up some items without a adding machine or anything, and and collect, from the customers. We did have all type of customer. In fact, there was what back then we used to call them colored people,
Yeah.
and those were the one that mostly come into our store during the weekend because they would be picking cotton during the weekdays. And so on the weekend, we would have them all come in, in trade and things like that. So he did have a mixture of white and color. I guess they call them black now, but that's what that's the type of business that we had. That we just sold groceries from meat to canned goods and things like that. No clothing, but just food, I guess you would call it.
Yeah. So interesting. And but you're also serving the kind of you call it back then, I guess colored, but now we call it black community or people of color community.
Yes.
And what the demographics like in your neighborhood? Is it primarily black or people of color?
Yes, I guess you would say because there was a lot of people that picked cotton at that time. Because I remember going to a home of one of them, at one time, and they asked me if I wanted to pick cotton. I said, sure. You know how cotton is real soft. But when you go out to pick a cotton, it has all these seeds in it that it's not as soft. You have to get the cotton around the seed and thing like that, where they send it to a mill or something to do that. And I said, how come this is so hard? Because I always thought that cotton was really soft, and they tell me, oh no, that's the way cotton is. But it's really hard to pick cotton. And that's what they did mostly there. But when I came to Houston, I noticed that now you see the end of North Main Street, I remember, was the medical center. There wasn't anything beyond that. In fact, Methodist was that. And we thought, I said, golly, that's a long way to go, from where we lived. And that was the end of Houston. They did have one restaurant a little further out, and we thought it was pretty far out. It was a seafood restaurant, Guido's, that they had out there. And once in a while, we would go there to eat. But that was the end of Houston. And that shows you how much it had grown since then. Because I came here in Houston in the late, I guess it would say in the 50s or early 50s, so
I guess before we move on to Houston, can you share with us some of your earliest memories back in the neighborhood?
some of my early memory in
Growing up?
well, yes, I guess you would say it's we had actually we did not the Chinese mostly kept to themselves, and we usually have dances and things like that we would have at the school because they had a large floor on the top above the school, and so we would have dances there. And then when we moved to Memphis, the house that we bought was pretty large, and because of my sister being older, they did have parties there a lot. You know, uh, most of the parties I hardly remembered, but I do remember that at one time we had I don't know what you would call it, but it was the Flying Tigers. We had one of the cap major that came with his crew, and they came to visit our place in um, at home and things like that. And I remember one of them said, "Oh, you're my little sister." I says, "Okay," And but it was very sad that I think later we heard that their plane was shot down, and all of them had passed on.
Wow.
And when I was going to school in Tennessee, I don't remember too much about it, but I do remember that I did have a few friends there, but mostly I kept to myself because I had a cousin that was about my same age and we played a lot together. Then I also had an older cousin that taught me how to shoot a bow and arrow. So we did that. Back then, there weren't too many toys electronic toys that we have. Uh, we used to cut out, there was what we call paper dolls, the cardboards, it comes in a book, and the dolls were a cardboard, and you have to cut out the dresses to fit them onto the dolls. And I don't remember in too much more toys that we did play with, except for dolls and things like that. Shirley Temple was one of the biggest things during that time. And I always wanted hair like hers because she had all these curls, coming down. Uh, I, there's not too much more to say. I know that my mother used to have a couple of dogs in the house, and it was so funny that all of them, everyone that she had, she always called them Pooch. And the two dogs she had called them Pooch. When she said Pooch, they both come running because they knew they were going to get something to eat. And she did keep a lot of cats around the house too, the store. So that's how come. I guess the kitty cats I don't particularly care too much for because they rub up against you so much. But other than that, she kept them around the house and she fed them also. That was good. But there wasn't too much to say about Rosedale because we didn't have anything to do. I know that a lot of time I would just sit out in front of the store and see what was going on because actually our store was right across from the courthouse in Rosedale. So, but there wasn't hardly anything to do. There was a movie theater, and that was it.
Do you and your family usually cook at home? Your parents will cook for you and your
My
siblings?
parents would cook all the time. We never had cookout. In fact, I never went to a restaurant until I came to Houston
Oh,
because we never, even in Tennessee, we never went to a restaurant. We always cooked at home. Either my sister or my brothers would cook, but we never went to a restaurant until we came to Houston. And I think one of the first one that I remember going to is still here is that Aladdin on West Gray. That was where my brother and them took me there, and that was one of the first one that I remember going to. But now, uh, and I think at that time, Ding Hao was on North Main. It was across the street from the medical center, and that was the first Chinese restaurant here that I recall, if I recall correctly.
yeah, that was by Linda Wu's father, Albert G, right?
Right. That was, yeah, that's her father. We were really good friend and thing like that. But really, I remember one time that Albert had this young boy there, and he would get him, and he'll bring him in. He says, "Oh, Susie, you got to watch this." He put a steak in front of that boy. He said, "Do you know that that little boy can eat the whole thing?" And he started laughing. He said, "I just love to see him eat." So anyway, that's what he would do, and thing like that. He was really a nice guy, though. We actually called them cousins because their last name was G, and I married into a G family. You know, my husband and I met my husband when I first came here because of his brother. His brother was one of them that anyone that came into town, he would show them around. His name was George G, and he would show them around. Especially, they said, especially the women. Anytime he see that there was a girl or anybody that came in town, he would jump to it and go show them around. So from what I heard, he went home and he told his brother, he said, I have the girls just for you, you know. And that's how I met my husband, is through his brother. And I think we were going out for at least 7 years before we got married, because we were going to get married before then, but he was drafted into the service. And so we waited until he came out before we were married.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I saw Susan wrote that you were exclusively dating even when
Right,
you
right. And I think when he was in the service, I had worked for a packing company for a little, for a summer or so, And then after that, because we were saving our money to get married, my parents didn't pay for the wedding or anything like that. We had to pay for the wedding. And that's where Albert G came in, because he did cater the wedding for us, which was really nice. But looking over, it has been a long time. But after we got married, we he had my husband had worked as a butcher for a while, and I worked as a clerk, a cashier rather. In the meantime, he also worked in a restaurant, and I was a hostess there. Uh, and then we decided to buy our own store. We had had a couple of grocery stores, and during that time, I found out that my sister's husband was doing signs for grocery stores that they used to put out on in the front or on the windows of of their special that they had. And so I went over to help him and things like that. And then so finally we decided to split up, you know. And my husband said, well, you can do it. I said, no, I can't do any sign like that. They're too big. But he talked me into it. So eventually I did start painting signs for grocery store and things. And in the meantime, he also went into the audio business too with some friends he had met. And that we were one of the first audio video store that was in Houston. In fact, they were trying to think of a name. And I told him, I said, we should call it audio video. He said, why audio and video? I said, because it's A, and that's what the first thing you would come up to when you go and look for video would be A. And they said, oh, okay. But we didn't have that much audio in it. We mostly had videos. Was one of the biggest variety of movies and things like that, because everything that came out we had, and we were known for that in Houston. And also we were also known for promotions that we had there. In fact, we did one of Star Trek, and we did one of the Ghostbuster, and there were several, and that. Jane Fonda, you know, and we won. In fact, we won a Jeep from one of them. One of the promotion did won first place on that. And the set that we did for Star Trek, people had heard about it in Houston, and some some of the organization had asked if they could borrow the set sometime and thing like that. And the person that when we had that promotion, it was really fun because the one that the Chinese that what was his name uh, that played in Star Trek.
He's Japanese. His
I
name
mean
is George
Japanese.
Takei.
What?
George Takei.
George Takei. He came into town and he was really nice and he sat up there and he would sign autograph and everything like that. And it was so funny that one of the customers says, "What planet are you from?" Because they really thought that and he just started laughing. But that was one of them that I really did remember. And sometime we would have Christmas uh, parties for the little kids to come in and things like that. So I guess we were, I worked in the store. Actually, I had retired then, but I still, helped them around in the store, which was nice. Just to keep me busy.
Yeah. I remember probably back then, like the video store where the kids hang out place. It's almost like kids would go after their school and like pick out movies to hang out with, right?
Well, we didn't show that much movie, but a lot of them would come in and rent a lot of the movies and things like that. Because I think we had over 60,000 titles.
Wow.
Most of them, I know Blockbuster and all of them always say, "Oh, we got 2,000 titles and things like that," but we had 60,000 different titles and things like that, and it actually with VHS, and that was one of the biggest things then, and then DVD came along, but we did have the largest library, I guess, in the United States, actually.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I remember seeing a Houston Public Media podcast about Susie's interview. I mean, Susan's interview, your daughter's interview a few years back in 2015. That was about the the Audio Video Plus store, and how like nostalgia people are still towards that kind of video culture, that entertainment that back then we only have like VCD and DVDs and
Yeah.
kids. Yeah, that's so
Uh-huh.
incredible. If you wouldn't mind going back a little bit regarding, we mentioned the family were only able to send you and your siblings to Chinese schools as opposed to white schools. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences back then?
Actually, I going to the Chinese school, everybody in there that spoke were Chinese. There wasn't any Caucasian or anyone but the Chinese people. And actually, we had, like I say, two teachers, and they taught us the way I guess regular school did and everything like that, because we did have an English teacher that came uh, in the morning and she taught us. And after she taught us, then the Chinese teacher would come in and teach us Chinese. But there's not, I mean, I didn't have any problem with it or anything like that. And we never had any problem with anybody complaining about it because I remember it was just a school all set by itself and it had its own parking lot, playground, and everything. And so that's how we had gone to school.
And how many families back then were in the school?
Hmm.
Was it a big school?
There was quite a few because actually they came from different little cities, a town around there. I mean, it's just like even the town that I live in. My my father had a cousin that has a store there, so his kid went to that school too. And then there was a few towns around Cleveland, Mississippi that other, and I remember there was a Ling family that lived in Cleveland. They were there, but there were quite a few different families that did go to the school, the one that had kids around there. But I remember, I guess when we were in my class, I think there was only three of us that were in my grade. There were two boys and myself, you know. And then of course my sister, like I have three older sister, and they all have their, grades there too. But I don't remember how many families were there. That's car. But I would say probably at least 30, maybe.
Is that all the Chinese families in Roosevelt back then?
No, there were probably more than that because actually, when I came to Houston, I'm finding out there was quite a few people that were there in Mississippi that I've never met from a different, different little towns and things like that. And they said that they had gone to that school after we left there, and they all know about the school and things like that. But there were quite a few family here in Houston that used to be in Mississippi, and they have moved here, you know. And I didn't know them there, but I met them here.
I see.
It's just like when I came here to Houston, actually, the population of the Chinese was very few. In fact, they had quite a few gatherings all the time, different family and things like that, because everybody knew everybody because it wasn't such a large uh, um, group of Chinese that was here during that time. It's just that everyone started moving in here, but for a long time, it just seemed like there weren't that many.
I see. Do you happen to like know where the curriculum taught in your school and like the
I'm
other?
sorry, what?
Uh, do you happen to know if the curriculum taught in your school versus the other schools could be different?
I really don't think so because actually the teachers did teach us what they were teaching, and because when I went from that school to go into uh, the elementary school in Memphis, I wasn't put back a grade or anything. I just continue on, with the studies there. It's just that I know that in Memphis there were more kids in the classroom than what I was used to or anything like that. But the as far as them teaching us, was the same as they would teach in any other school.
I see. Um, yeah, I was actually just learning from Dr. Chow, our program manager, yesterday that there was a father back then in Mississippi who allowed his daughter to attend white schools, and he's tried to sue them for that, and but lost the case. Do you happen to know that case?
Uh, you, I heard some of that. What was that?
Oh yeah, it was a. I mean, it was. actually in a book that was written that a woman whose father sued the state of Mississippi to allow his daughter to attend white schools, but he lost the case. So yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't like checked into the detail of that story yet. But do you happen to know about that story, or happen
No,
to know the person? I see.
What was the store, Ann?
Oh, it was about a story about a woman whose father sued the state of Mississippi because of
Correct.
the
So just the background, she kind of, we don't firsthand know the story as much, but as my mother had said, her father had a paper sister, and the paper sister was of that family, and it was called Lum versus the Board of Education. So I'm not really sure on my facts as to what year that actually took place. But yeah, so those families also ended up moving to Houston. The three siblings that we knew, that were it was, her name is Kate Lum now, but so her maiden name I guess would have been Kate Wong,
hmm
and she had two daughters and a son, and it was the two daughters I think that were part of the Lum versus the Board of Education. And so all three of those children also moved, but I'm not sure about the timeline or the timetable.
they were here before we were. They
I
moved here before we did.
I see. Yeah, that's such interesting history.
So my mom actually moved here. I think I told you
Yeah.
in the 50s, but the rest of the family didn't come. Her father and the other siblings, besides her elder brothers, didn't come until later,
Yeah,
a couple of years later. So
that's cool.
I hope that helps your timeline. I know you're trying to weave all these stories together, makes it interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Like the answers from yeah, you helping me to weave through the timelines. Thank you. And I was wondering what kind of expectations did your parents brought you up to with? Like what kind of family values that your parents brought you up with?
Family value that my parents brought me up in. I know my father had always told me at one time, that I guess you would say life is for the living and not for the dead. That was when my younger sister passed on. Actually, he never had gone back to her gravesite. She was buried in Mississippi. But as far as value, I guess we know that we were not supposed to do, in fact, I hear a lot of people when they talk, sometimes they would curse and things like. I never learned to do that. I have never, I have never been able to do that at all. And I know that he had never done that before. And
Tell her that you grew up in the church.
and the thing about it, he used in Mississippi. He never went to the he never went to the church there, but he would donate money to the church, and he would send us to the church in Mississippi, in Rosedale, Mississippi. And I think at one time when they had the Christmas program, uh, the pastor had given my sister a wrong time when the program was supposed to start, and we were an hour late. And so he said, "Oh, I guess it's just like the Chinese. They have an hour late time." And my sister went back and told my father. And after that, we had never gone back to that church. But when we moved to Memphis, We did find another church that was a Baptist church that we did go there. And my father, because he worked in the store all the time, he had never gone to church in Mississippi. But when he moved here to Houston, he did go to the Chinese Baptist church and he did join the church then. And he had gone every Sunday since then. In fact, he was one of the deacons and he was one of the repairmen. Whenever they needed something to be repaired, he was down there to help them out because he did do a lot of work on his own, like housework and then anything that needed to be fixed, he could fix it. In fact, when we built our house, he was the one that went out there every day to make sure the construction was done the way he wanted done, you know. So that house is still standing here in Houston. Well, I sold it a few years back, but my daughter passed by there. She said, "Oh yeah, it's still there, and I still see the fence there and everything else." So I'm pretty sure it'd be there for a long time. In fact, it was the only house that we know of. I mean, the only street when we lived there, the only one that didn't flood any time. You know, it was in the Lindale section, and a lot of the street around there flooded, but that street did not flood for some reason.
Wow, I'm sure your father did such a good job that it will last for longer. Much
Oh yeah.
amazing. What kind of career did your parents expect you and your siblings to go into?
That's one thing. My parents never did expect us to go into anything, but he just wanted us to do whatever we wanted to do. And it's the same, and it's the same way with the picking our spouse. They never decide on, oh, you shouldn't marry him, you should marry so and so. Whoever you pick is yours. He had always told us that whoever you pick is your husband. I'm not going to be the one to live with him. You are. And so, out of all of us that were married, none of us had gotten a divorce. We all stayed married until our spouse passed on. And I'm sorry to say, I think I am the only one that's still living in our family. But my husband does have three sisters that are still living, and all of them had passed on. But that's one thing I'm proud to say that I guess we don't believe in divorce. You know, you just work things out. But like he was married to her over my mother over 50 years. So,
Wonderful. And I guess the question is, what kind of would
oh,
you?
the business, he never, in fact, my older sister, she was a nurse, but the rest of us, when we married, their husband went into the grocery business, so all of us was stayed in the grocery business. I think I am probably the only one that went outside of the grocery and had the video store. My husband decided on a video store. We did work in the grocery business. We did work in a restaurant, and finally end up in the video store. But he had never told us that we had to do one thing or another. Now, my oldest sister, she married a dentist, and so, but she was a nurse before then. So I think professional, they were they were the only one that had gotten a profession other than the grocery business. My oldest brother had a grocery store, and so did my youngest one. I mean, but he never had told us that we had to do one thing or another. So we all went out on our own and decided on what we wanted to do, and that's what we did. That was, you know,
That was wonderful. And what was the church denomination that you went to?
Chinese Baptist Church.
I see. And
Yeah.
it was most of the Chinese community there as well.
Yes. In fact, most of them were there. In the early years, I did teach Sunday school there. That was when they were down in, I think it was Lamar. That was when we first had the Chinese Baptist Church, they call it. And we were there for a long time. Uh, During the early years, I remember teaching Sunday school there. In fact, after some of the kids grew up, they'd come and say, "Oh, Miss G, I remember you teaching me Sunday school." And I cannot remember them when they were young, but we had fun doing that because they had uh, they had different socials there too, you know, things like that. And one that they really, the Chinese people, um, another thing that we did, we have what they call a bowling league in the Chinese community, you know, that was uh, that because so many people here in Houston had grocery store or restaurant and they had worked, you know, 7 days a week and didn't have time out. So we would have a bowling league for some of the younger groups. And they would go and uh, once a week we would have teams and things like that and compete, you know. But every year we would have an annual dance with San Antone, and sometime New Orleans would come in and we would have a dance here or we would go there, you know, where the Chinese community would get together too, which was, but that's once a year, you know, they would have something like that. Even now, the CACA has been having few social, like a social uh, dinner or something like that, or a scholarship for the young uh, kids. And we still have a young CACA youth club here that the Chinese would get together uh, every so often.
So interesting.
I am not as active as in the CACA, but my daughter is now.
Yeah,
And at one time when I was in we had an auxiliary too, you know, but now they combine it. So we don't have an auxiliary anymore. We just have a CACA meeting. But at one time we did have an auxiliary and I was one of the president of the auxiliary. And at that time, uh, Pearl Buck, who wrote The Good Earth, she came into town and we had the honor of having a luncheon for her.
wow.
Yeah, which was really nice. You know, in fact, we went to Ding Hao with to have that luncheon and thing like that with them. So that was really nice. And
Um,
we also invite, like, sometime they would, during we would have these stands, they would have a Miss Chinatown. They go out to San Francisco. And so sometime we would have those, whoever win would come in and we would honor them with a luncheon too. Things, you know, different social and thing like that. Even though now we still try to, you know, at least see our friends once in a while, but it's harder even now. But I do call them every so often.
Wonderful. Um, Going back a little bit, can you tell us a little bit about your college life? I feel like in the 1950s, there probably.
Yeah, well, I didn't have too much of a college life, but I did go to University of Houston for a year, and then my sister wanted to go to Sacred Heart, and so I said, okay, I'll go with you there. And I went there for a year or so, but I I went to University of Houston for a year, and then I went to Sacred Heart Dominican College, and for about a year too, and I never graduated because by that time I think my husband was out of the service, and we decided to get married. So I never went back to school then. But all during my life, at one time when I was in high, no, it was elementary, a little girl, I mean, a friend of mine that was sitting across from me, she was drawing a picture, and I looked at it and I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm drawing a picture." And I looked at it and I said, "You know, that looks exactly like you." She said, "It does?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "I didn't know you could draw." She said, "Oh, it's easy. Let me show you." So that's when I really start, you know, taking up drawing and things like that. And I did do uh, mostly, instead of drawing, I did lettering. And I think that came in handy when I went and did the signs for the grocery store, because you have to have an eye, just like if you were going to print something, you have to have an eye to look forward to see how much space you have. Otherwise, you run out of space before you get to the end of the word. And that's one thing I did learn to do. And that probably helped me when I did paint signs for the stores that I had, you know. But now I guess they don't use that. They can have it print out real easy now. Compared, I mean, they don't have custom made signs like that. I don't see them in the window anymore. It's mostly printed out already.
Yeah, but I do feel like that nostalgic of like the handwriting is so important for many people. So like having that skill to like draw and have like hands-on creativity is really important, I'm sure.
Yeah, I really like uh, printing, I guess, or writing. In fact, one of my friends, she liked my writing so much that she asked me if I would do all her wedding invitation, and which I did. You know, I said, "Boy, that is really so." But it was over 100 and something invitation, and I wrote every one of them out for her because she wanted it to be script and thing like that. And I says, "Okay, we'll do that." So I wrote them all out for her and gave them to her, and she was real happy about that. But I do like to, I guess you would say, I do put myself into a lot of different things that, but I'm not really a master of any of them. Like I've worked with leather before, you know, that I could do leathering on, I do lettering on leather goods, and I do a lot of crochet, sewing. In fact, when I was younger and I had my daughter, I used to make matching clothes, you know, all the time with her. And one of my friend told me, she said, when she outgrows those dresses, will you save them for my daughter? I said, how do you know you're going to have one? And she said, oh, I will. And what she did have one. But by that time, you know, we didn't give her the dresses. But anyway, I do have a lot of hobbies, I guess you would call it, more than anything. You know, like I say, I have a lot of hobby, a lot of things that I can do, but I'm not a master of any of them, except I guess for writing and things like that. You know, because I do love to print and thing like that. So and once in a while I will draw different things, but I do a lot of that on shirts and things that at one time when they came out with those, where you would paint the shirts and thing, I would do that. But most of the time I would have to get a pattern, which is like if I see something, I can draw it, but it has to be a pattern, and I would get a dress that I like, but there's something that I don't like about it, I would change it and make it my own. In fact, I designed my own wedding dress and I had somebody make it for me. And she told me, I told her exactly what I wanted and she did exactly what I did. So, and I brag about it. I said, I'm probably the only one that got married in a $25 dress because I went out and bought the material and thing like that, and she made it for me. And so that was one thing.
How was the wedding like? How was your wedding?
How was my wedding?
Yeah, where was
I
it?
think I think I had five bridesmaids and a groomsman and five groomsmen and my cousin, and then with the flower girl and the rain barrel. And it was so, in fact, I was really happy about the wedding except for one thing. We had it at a church and they had put all these beautiful flowers up and things like that. But after the wedding, you usually have a reception right afterward. So we decided to go into they had a big hall there. So we went into the hall for the reception and we said we'd take the pictures later. But by the time we went back into the church to take the picture, they had taken the flowers away because they were having service then. So we didn't have a lot of the pictures of the flowers that we had there. And we did take pictures of the bridesmaid and groom outside of the church and thing. But other than that, it was great. Yeah. And I think we had, in fact, I told my husband, I said, are you sure you're going to want to invite all the, we had over 200 something people there because I think we invite everybody in Houston at that time because they, like I say, it was a pretty close knitted, group of people, that everybody knew everybody. If they didn't know me, they knew my husband. And because he had such a large family, everybody knew them. There were 13 in his family, so counting the parents. So
That's really interesting. Um, I guess we didn't cover what subject did you study in college? First in U of H, then in Sacred Hearts.
U of H, I went there. I don't know why I went because actually, like my father told me, he said I could go if I don't want to, I don't have to, and things like that. Because I knew what I was going to do anyway already. I was going to get married and, and things like that. And I wasn't looking for anything that was like being a teacher or anything like that. So the only thing that if I would have gone for, if I really wanted to, I would look for something in advertisement. That's what, but I didn't. I mean, it wasn't something that I really wanted to do, but I would go into our advertisement
I see.
because I did have a friend that used to draw for the newspaper and things like that. He would draw these for Battlestein, these fashion and things like that. And I guess I really liked the way he did a lot of things, and I would ask him about it. But then I said, no, I don't think I want to do that. So I none of my when I went to college, I just took what you call accounting type courses because most of it is just like I worked in the grocery store and you learn a little bit more about things like that, you know. So that's what those are the courses that I did take, and that was it. But like I say, as soon as my husband came out of the service, we were planning our wedding then, you know, and he was in there for 2 years. In fact, I talked my sister and his sister at that time. I didn't drive. And so I talked them into going. He was stationed in Fort Sill. So I talked them into driving me up there to see him in Fort Sill at one time. So we drove up there and we spent a night or two up there and we came home. And when he got out of the service, you know, like I say, the most of the enjoyment you have if you don't bowl or anything like that. We didn't have anything to do. We would go to a movie. But he didn't want to, we didn't go to a movie for 2 years because every day in the service, that's all he did was see a movie because they usually, he said they would get it first, you know, before it goes out to the public. And so he would see every movie there was. So we didn't go to a movie for about a couple of years
Is that
after he was.
Love Foot movie also one of the reasons that your you decided to start a audio video plus shop?
No, in fact, that came quite a few years later because when we first got married, like I say, we had the grocery stores, you know. In fact, uh, yeah, we did work in the grocery store. He had worked in a grocery store and in a restaurant, and I had worked as a cashier too. And then we bought our own grocery store. We had a couple of them. Then after we were in the grocery business, he was he would go out and there was a because actually it wasn't that busy. I would stay there with a butcher that we had hired, and he would go out and meet some friends, and that's when he decided with his friends to go into the video business. So that's when from there we sold the store to go into the video business. It wasn't because he had watched all these movies. Yeah. But it was one, I think video was coming out at that time to be one of, and we were probably one of the first one to decide that would be a good thing. So we had opened the video store then. It was the first one that came up, you know. And, but it wasn't the last one to close down though.
See. Um, I guess maybe you were still very, very young back then, but do you happen to have some of the memories about World War II or any topic related to that during your
World
childhood?
War II. My brother served in the World War II, and I remember I had to write to them because my mom could not write, and I was the only one that she would ask, and I would write to both my brothers, and they would tell them, you know, they would tell me different things of what they did. But as far as my father would listen to the news every day and things like that, but I don't remember that much about the going on in World War II, but trying to think. No, I can't say that I do remember a lot. I remember Roosevelt was talking a lot on the radio. That's what my father would be listening to and things like that.
I see.
And I
And
think I remember the very first time when they started the war. But it's been, sometimes if you don't talk about it, you actually lose your memory on certain things, you know. But I do remember sometime, I don't remember what I was listening to, but I remember our big radio there, one of those great big box radio type thing, and they said that they were going to start a war. And I was yelling at my father to come here, and that was it. But other than that, I don't. And when they did get out of the service, um, my father had sent both my brothers to China to get a wife. And so both of them went to China and they both brought back a wife. And that's about all that, when they were in Mississippi, they stayed there for a little while and then he decided to send them here to open their own business. And so that's what he did. See, he sent both of them here to open their own business. But other than that, I guess I don't know whether you would call them
I see.
I don't know. Actually, I was really surprised that, when he did bring them back a wife and thing like that. But they all seemed to be really nice. My, my second, not my second brother, she went and tried to learn. In fact, she went to learn English. And so at the store, when I went to help them, she would say, "You talk to me in English and I would answer you in Chinese. That way I could pick up more English and you could pick up more Chinese." So we did do that for a while, you know. But after all that, I had forgotten a lot of it.
You said your husband was in the army for a number of years. Where was he stationed?
He was stationed in Fort Sill.
I see.
Uh, in fact, he was there for a long time. He was a cook there. And I told him, I said, "You don't cook." He said, "But I can read." So he decided he wanted to be a cook, which suited him very nicely because he liked to sleep, early and then wake up early and things like that. And all during that time, whoever was in command, once in a while, he would make something special for him so that he would stay there. And he actually did his whole tour in Fort Sill, you know, as a cook. He brought home a cookbook and he gave it to his sister. And he said, "Hey, sis, I brought you something." She said, "What?" "I brought you a cookbook." And she said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." And he gave it to her. And she said, "I can't use this. This is for 100 and something people. I'm not going to cook for 100 and something people." And he said, "Well, can't you divide it down?" So I don't know what happened to the cookbook. But anyway, that was so funny that he brought home a cookbook that he used in the service for the, you know, and you could imagine like use 100 pounds of potatoes and things like that. And he was telling me at one time, he told this soldier, he says, "Go wash the strawberry." And he says, "Okay." He goes in there and he like what are you doing? He said, I'm washing the strawberry. He had put soap in the water to wash the strawberry. And the soap that they used it Lysol, lye soap. And they had to throw all that bash away.
Um, I'm also curious, how was it like bringing up three children? Do they also help in the grocery store when they were growing up?
My daughter, I took her everywhere I went. In fact, they would say that she was probably the only girl that was brought up in a bowling alley. Because when we went to bowl, she would go with us, and then when she get tired, she just lay on the benches and go to sleep. Uh, my two boys, they weren't any trouble. In fact, as they grew older, my mother had taken care of them most of the time. They didn't grow up in the grocery store like I did. Uh, Most of the time, they would stay with my mother or my husband's mother because we would go by and pick them up and things like that. But and then when my daughter started school, she would stay mostly with my husband mother, my mother-in-law. After school, she would come home from school and go there. So we would go pick them up after we got off of work. Yeah, I didn't have. In fact, I had a lot of help from my parents, both parents. So I didn't have any them in the store with me as much.
So who are the clients or the customers for the new grocery store in Houston?
Okay, the first one, uh, I would guess you would say it was white and Mexicans, you know. And then the last store we had was in a black neighborhood. So that was what we had mostly. In fact, it was so that one store that we did, there was the last one, the gentleman in front that had the store was robbed and shot, but he lived. And we bought that store. And then there was someone that came in and robbed us at that store. And I was the only one there. My husband had gone out to deliver some of the signs that I had painted. And so I walked out after he left. I guess you would call it stupid me. I walked out to see, and I saw his car, and I went back in. And then when I called my husband and told him that we were just robbed and things like that, he said, "Did you call the police?" I said, "Yes." So when he came back that night, we happened to be driving around, and I looked and I said, "That's the car." And he said, "What?" I said, "That is a car the guy was driving that robbed us." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah, that's the car." So we called the police and told them that the car was there and things like that. They caught the guy. We had to go down and identify him and everything like that. So we all went in. We went into the courtroom, and they had the man there. And what was at first they asked you to identify him in a lineup, and we did. And what he did was put on a jacket to try to disguise it. And I said, "No, that is the guy that robbed me." And so when we went to the court for his court day, uh, we were sitting there and things like that. And they had called him up and said, "Who in this courtroom know him and and had been robbed by him?" I tell you, everybody in that courtroom stood up.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and so they did caught a guy that was really
what was great, and I couldn't believe it. I turned around and looked. I said, "Wow, I could not believe that." So I don't know whether he was how many years he got for being in prison or something like that, but he was caught.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
So
so
anyway, that was one of the experience, and I guess just when he went with his friends, and they were working around and things like that, and they thought about getting uh, theater and all this and that, and that's when they were starting to talk about the video store and things. So then that's when he decided that's what he would rather go into. So it was this one guy that was a lawyer, and then there was another one that he knew from University of Houston, and that's when they decided to go into partnership and have a you know start thinking about video store. They had a little business first, and then they went into the video store biz. That's when my husband bought the video store with a friend of his, which was uh, his father was a jeweler, and we met him, and he talked to him about that, and so that's when they went into partnership there to own the first video store there was. But it was my husband passed on before we could actually open the store. But he did work in there to get it ready and things like that. But he did pass on before the store was actually open.
so interesting.
And we still stayed as partner and things like that. And so I did work in the back, like even though because I had retired and things like that, even though I didn't get paid, but I did some of the bookkeeping and things like that there. So during my lifetime, I guess you would say that I've worked in a restaurant, grocery store, mostly, and for a while we were in the theater business, which was right before, or actually doing before we had the video store. We had owned a theater which was called Champion Theater. I don't know exactly how things went on in that way because usually I just let my husband take care of all the business part of the thing, and I just go along with whatever he wanted. And then when he decided to go into a video store, I says okay. So we went that way, and ever since then, that's what we were doing. We had worked in the store, and I just helped with the promotion, and I helped with the bookkeeping, and that was it.
Wow. And
It was something that to keep me busy, even though I didn't make any money or anything like that. But it was enough to keep me busy, and as long as I was busy, I was fine.
uh, and how long are you and your husband in the theater business for?
I
Is this
think actually we were not even in the theater business for a year. It wasn't. I remember we had opened the theater business and things like that. Then we decided to not go that way, I guess. They he handed it off to his partners. He didn't want any more to do with it. Um, his partners all continued doing that, and then that's when he went into the video business instead. Because I don't even think we were in there not even a year.
I'm also wondering what are some of the most important and significant friendships that you built like during the years of your working, you said in restaurants and the grocery store and the theater, like, and the audio video plus shop. Like, did you ended up becoming friends with some of the customers or the regulars of those shops?
Hmm. I don't think so because I knew a lot of the customers and things like that, but actually being friends with them, not as much because I still socialize with a lot of my Chinese friends. And I guess business was business. And then I don't think I had any close American friends. When I was going to school, uh, high school here, there was a group of five of us that used to hang out quite often. And I never felt like I was any different than any of them because they all were really nice and things like that. In fact, one of my friends had kept in touch with me for a long time. And she was asking me, because I never went back to any of the reunion. And she was asking me, she said, you know, the last time that I talked to her, she called me and she said, Susie, you know, you have to go back to one of the reunion because all of us are dying. And I said, really? She said, and she was telling me a couple of the friends, a couple of the students that we knew did pass on, you know, and things like that. But she had gotten married and I don't know her last name anymore, so I haven't kept in touch with her. But she did know my name because she knew my husband, you know, that we were going together. And she knew we got married. But I haven't heard from her in a long time. So whether she passed on or not, I don't know now. But those were probably the closest I've ever come to any of my school friends. But as far as business friend, the only friends that I know that at the time when my husband was in the cinema, you know, was in the theater business, there were a few that we knew and socialized with, but I haven't seen them now in a while. But if they were not close friends, we just once in a while. I mean, they used to have uh, a softball team. That's what it was, and we would go and watch them. And I had gotten to know their wives pretty well and things like that. But other than that, I don't. I haven't socialized with too many Caucasians. Most
Um,
of them are Chinese.
Mostly Chinese.
It's not that I don't like them, anything like that. I guess I don't see them that often and never thought about it.
Were you able to make any friends that are of African or Latino American descent?
Even with the people that we had hired to work in the stores, I don't think so. But like I say, there was one, yeah, there was one guy that when they played ball that I had talked to a lot, but actually, I would say I don't really socialize with any of them at all. You know, I don't see them outside of just like if they play ball and things like that. It's after I thought about it, yeah, that's true. Most of the people that I socialize with are Chinese, you know, that I have lunch and things like that with. Now, my daughter has a friend that she calls and talk to her a lot, and I do
we do go out with her a lot, but in fact, we used to, we used to go with her and her husband to Vegas a lot.
Wow.
Yeah, my husband and her husband, we would go to Vegas and we would play the slot machine and things like that. But in other words, most of the Caucasian that I would socialize with are people that we were in business with too, and things. So uh, I would go with her and we would go together and play slots and things like that. And back, those were the jeweler. There's a jeweler that he passed on too, but him and his wife. But when we came back, we never went out together though. Most of the time it was in Vegas that we were, when we go and make a trip there. That was when I would see them.
And I guess for your children, like, can you share with us some of your children's, like, your memories and experiences bringing them up, and what are they doing now? Like, what professions are they in?
Well, one of them had passed on. He died from cancer. And
Oh,
you know what Susan does. And my oldest son, I have four grandkids. Um, in fact, it was so funny that it took him a long time to finally get married. He's married to a Caucasian girl, which is really nice. I really love their family because their family is more like our family. They're very, they think about each other and all this and that. And it's a large family. She has a large family. In fact, she has her sister. It is so funny that her brother has a set of twins, her sister has a set of twins, and she has a set of twins. So there's three sets of twins in her family. And when my son had his first child, he called and said that she was pregnant. I said, "Oh, great," and things like that. So anyway, on the third one, he said, "Mom, Kara's pregnant again." I said, "Oh, that's good. And she's going to have twins." I said, "What?" Anyway, she did have twins. And what was so unusual is my husband has twin brothers, and she has a twin aunt. So I guess it had to come in the family somewhere. But anyway, he's a physical therapy and and she is a professor at the at University of, what is that, Susan?
St. Edward's University.
St. Edward's University in Austin. Um, so they are living in Austin, and every so often we would go and visit them, or they would come down and visit. In fact, they were down here probably a couple of weeks ago, and so I guess it's our turn to go up there, but we haven't been up there, because of this virus and thing like that. I hardly go anywhere. Susan is the one that goes out, and she would buy the groceries and everything like that. And I just stay home. I, in fact, that I try to get out every so often just to walk around or something like that. But when they're home, I usually do go and, we mingle together, which my son is very careful with his kids. In fact, he's teaching them at home instead of sending them off to school and things like that. But they're all doing fine, and I get to talk to them FaceTime every so often when I called them, they were, they would talk to me about what they were doing and things like that, which was really surprising because one this past birthday that I had, I said, kids, they came in and I said, kids, you know what I want for my birthday? And their ears all perked up, what? And things like that. It's like, all I want is a homemade birthday card. And they were all shocked, and things like that. And his dad said, well, that means y'all better start on it. And one of them says, oh, that's a long way off. He said, before you know it, it'll be here. And they all did make me a beautiful birthday card.
Wow.
So I was happy with that.
How old are they?
What?
How old are your grandkids?
Right now,
Mhm.
I'm 88.
Oh, how about your grandkids?
My grandkids, they're 13, 9, and 7.
No, 13,
13, 10,
11.
13, 11, and 9. 13, 11, and 9. The twins are 9 years old now.
I see. Wow. I guess, how are you coping in the COVID? I guess, like, as a,
Well, you know, my daughter and them bought me an iPad quite a while back, and they have games on there a lot. I do try to play some of the games. They said if your mind is working and so, you should play this game. So I would add that game into it, and I try to work a lot of the games and things like that, which I do most of the days because I don't hardly do anything else except, I need to when I need to wash my clothes, which is easy. You could put it in the washer and thing like that. You don't have any of the homework and thing. But other than that, I just sit around. Sometime I would crochet still and call my friends and catch up on the late gossip and thing and ask how their family is doing. And sometimes they would call me. So next thing I know, the day's gone. you know.
to hear? Yeah, you're taking it easy and, yeah, getting socialized on iPad and all that. That's great.
Uh, Yeah, my iPad. In fact, my iPad, what it tells me, he said, "Oh, you are not on as much as you were on last week. You were 4 hours down." Or it would tell me, "Oh, you were on for 8 hours this week." I mean, it tells me how long I've been on the iPad sometimes. So I think it's really funny. I was surprised when I looked at it one day and it told me when I was on how many hours I was on. I said, wow, I was on that long. So if I don't find anything else to do, that's what I do. Go to my iPad and I do play the games and things like that a lot. And a lot of time when the kids come in, I would have them, before this virus hit, I would have them and they would sit on my lap and things like that, and they would play the game with me and all this and that. So it's enjoyable.
Yeah, yeah, it's good to hear. And I'm also wondering to switch note a little bit that, like during COVID early on, we kind of had some xenophobic kind of attacks on the Asian American community, as well as the current president calling the virus the China virus or the Kung flu. And I'm also wondering, like, since your upbringing in Mississippi and now in Houston, like throughout your life, have you been like in any way attacked due to your Asian heritage or like Asian, I guess, American identity?
I have, in fact,
It's so funny. All during my life, I've never thought of me being a Chinese,
Mm.
you know, because I guess all my friends never separate me from them. So a lot of time I would go with them and things like that, and I never thought of myself being different. And my parents, they have never taught us, that there was a difference in color or anything, so we haven't really, I guess that's one thing when I started thinking about it, everywhere I went, it seemed like my friends, they all treat me as if I was one of them. So I never thought too much of it because in the group of five that we had, there was also a Mexican girl that was there. But at that time, no black was in the school. They segregate the black from the white. So I guess it never, in fact, when one time I was in Foley's and shopping around, and this Mexican lady come up there and start speaking to me in Spanish. And I looked at her, I said, I don't speak Spanish. I told her in Spanish because that's one thing. I said, no español. And so she said, oh, and she looked at me kind of funny. And then I started thinking, I said, because I was out in the sun so much that I was very dark. I was more dark complected than I am now. And I said, well, I guess they could have very easily mistaken me for that, but I never thought of anything being different because no one has shown me that I was different.
And that's definitely a very inspiring note to hear that
Oh,
we weren't like, yeah, like supposed to be thought of or treated as different, being
I
brown.
remember one time when I was in grade school, I guess you would call it, there was this one boy that had said something and it did stick with me. But my sister, she said, just ignore it. He said, chink, chink, Chinaman. And I said, what? And she said, oh, don't pay any attention. And so we walked away, and that was the one and only time, you know. But I have never heard that again. And I guess I never thought of it that way, though.
Yeah. And you said that was in Mississippi.
What? In
I,
Mississippi, yeah. That was in Mississippi.
I see.
But in Mississippi, it's just like they call the black names too and things like that. So we don't pay any attention to that because when we had a lot of uh, customers that were black, they all came in. We kid around with them, we talked to them, and everything like that. So, you know, but like I say, we never socialized with them, but we never socialized with Caucasians either. You know, they were just customers that came in, but they they knew my father's name and things like that, and you know, and I never saw any of the kids. Most of them came in to shop and things like that, and they never had any of the kids around. So it's very seldom that we would see kids.
And your children, your three children, also hasn't experienced anything like that in their schooling in college.
As far as I know, they haven't. They have not told me of anything like that.
Mhm.
But uh,
Yeah,
I haven't heard anything that they've experienced anything like that.
that's good to hear. Thank you for sharing.
What?
Thank you for sharing.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I also wonder, since we're approaching the end of the interview, like what are the proudest moments in your life or the proudest achievements that you would like to leave for the archive to remember you with?
That I
Like,
guess I would say that I had lived a pretty good life, and
that's
that
wonderful.
my family is what I want, and all my relatives are really the one that are still here. They're all real nice, and they've always been close. We've always been a close knitted family. I don't think there's anything that I regret because I think I've lived a pretty full life. I've had children and I've had marriage, and my parents were really good. I mean, what else can you ask for? You don't have any enemy, so that's one thing good. The way I see it now, it's so funny, I hear about these deaths and things like that. It's really sad that all these people are shooting one another. I wish they never had passed the law that you can have a gun. My parents did have a gun, but they never had it where we could get to it or anything like that. But I just hope things will be better next year.
Yeah, we're really relying on everyone in this upcoming election to like vote.
Oh,
Have you have you got any thoughts about that?
I'm sorry, what?
Have you got any thoughts you would like to share regarding the upcoming election next week?
Well, not really. I don't want actually, like somebody had said on TV, I'm not a Republican and I'm not a Democrat, but you vote on the person that you think is the best. But there is a lot of things that I do disagree with the president now, but I hope we have a better year next year, this coming November. I'm just hoping things will change for the best. Like I pray for that every day, that
Yeah.
thing will be better. And it's been nice talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susie. Yeah,
I hope I gave you what you were looking for.
definitely. There's so many learning about history, about people, and yeah, that's actually one of the most rewarding experience to like have that kind of very, um, like the sharing of your personal memory. That's very, very heartwarming.
But thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I'll get in touch with Susan later on because we might also be interested to collect the data, like the address of the grocery stores that you ran in both Mississippi and in yeah in Houston. That would be really interesting for a mapping project that we're doing online. If
Oh,
that's great. Thank you, Susie.
uh huh.
For the rest
Thank
of
you for having